This uncontrolled crossing is on the Avenue de la República, in front of the plaza of the beautiful arched building of the Monumento de la Revolución in Mexico City. The crossing is 3 lanes wide, with all traffic coming from one direction, going counterclockwise around the plaza. The lane closest to the plaza seems to be marked for special use, but sometimes regular drivers move into that lane. The edges of both sides of the street are flush with the plaza and sidewalks and lined with cement posts about 8 feet apart. Each post is about 2 feet high and a foot wide. There are panels of truncated domes between some of the posts, but they only have about 4 domes per square foot, so they are very difficult to detect. The night after I made these videos, I came out of the plaza and accidentally walked halfway across the first lane without realizing I had entered the street. We'll start analyzing this crossing by getting my crossing time. I start crossing now and reach the other side now. That was 6 seconds. Returning, I start crossing now and reach the other side now. That was 6.8 seconds. We consider the crossing time to be the longest time, which in this case was 6.8 seconds, so we'll round it off and say that my crossing time is 7 seconds. Now we want to find out what is the warning time of approaching vehicles when it is quiet, and see if it is longer than my crossing time. By quiet, we mean when we cannot hear any specific temporary sounds directly, we just hear the residual sound. In this case, the residual sound level of quiet was very noisy, which is typical for any crossing in the afternoon in the middle of a big city. So, as I stand at the edge of the street, I am closing my eyes to listen while I aim the camera toward the approaching traffic, and I will report when it seems to get quiet. Once it gets quiet, I will report the instant that I think I hear something that might be a vehicle, and we can time how many seconds pass from when I heard the vehicle until it arrives in front of me. Quiet? No, not quiet. I hear a car. Not quiet. Heard a car. We won't count the warning times of these cars that were heard when it was not quiet. We'll wait until I hear a car when quiet. It's quiet. I hear a car. 2 cars pass now, which is almost 4 seconds after I heard one of them. The cars were in the second and third lanes. Well, we now have all the information we need to know that this is a situation of uncertainty. That is, we know now that when it is quiet, there could be a car coming that could reach me before I'm even halfway across the street. If I had started to cross just before I heard that car, that is, while it was still quiet, I'd still be in the second lane when it arrived, right in its path. Since I plan to analyze the risk of crossing in this situation of uncertainty, I'll note the warning times of several more vehicles heard when quiet to see if this one was typical or not. I'll say now when the car passes. It's quiet. I hear a car. Now, that was 2.7 seconds of warning. It's quiet. I hear a car. Now, that was only 2.1 seconds of warning. I measured the warning times of several other vehicles when quiet, and the longest warning time was almost 4 seconds. Okay, it's no surprise that this is a situation of uncertainty, since we know that in most cities, you can't hear approaching vehicles until they're very close, and sometimes, if they're moving slowly enough, we can't hear them even when they pass. So, now let's analyze the risk of crossing using our checklist, Risk Analysis for Situations of Uncertainty. I'll record that this was at about 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon at the Avenue de la República, and that I'm not sure whether I have the right-of-way here since I don't know the laws in Mexico. The first thing I'll need to figure out is, how likely is it that I would be surprised by an approaching vehicle if I crossed using my hearing? That is, when it's quiet and I think it's clear to cross, how likely is there a vehicle coming that could reach me before I get to the other side? Well, that depends on traffic volume, which is high right now, and the warning time, which I think is short. I can't hear them until they're 2 to 4 seconds away, and I need 7 seconds to cross. Putting those together, the likelihood that I would be surprised by an approaching vehicle when it is quiet and I thought it was clear is high. Now I want to consider how likely it is that if I start to cross when quiet and I am surprised by an approaching vehicle, it will hit me. The first factor on the checklist asks if there is what is called a multiple threat or more than one lane, because if there is, I'd be more likely to be hit. I mark that yes, there is indeed more than one lane. And let's look at what happens. Here, a car in the first lane slows down and pedestrians start to cross in front of it, and oops, a driver in the next lane comes flying by and the pedestrians almost have to jump back to keep from being run over. The rest of the things on the list seem to indicate that drivers are likely to yield based on research of those factors. That is, with few exceptions, most of them are going rather slowly. They expect pedestrians since there are lots of people walking around and crossing. The visibility and road conditions are good. There are groups of pedestrians, although I'm not sure whether I'd be crossing with one of them, so I'll mark that I don't know about that. But I would feel safe waiting with a foot in the street, and if I were blind, I would be using a cane, both of which research shows would make the drivers more likely to yield. As far as the driver's culture, the pedestrians here seem to assume the drivers will not stop. They wait for a gap in traffic rather than trying to make the driver stop. I did see a few drivers slow down and wait for pedestrians, but here you see 2 sets of pedestrians start to cross but then pull back because the drivers did not seem to slow down, although when a group of pedestrians start crossing from the other side, a driver does wait and everyone crosses. So I would tend to say that in this community the drivers do not reliably stop, although I don't know what they would do if I had a white cane. So putting everything together, given all the factors that seem to indicate the drivers would stop, but observing that they don't tend to, I would say that the likelihood that I would be hit if I started to cross when a vehicle is only 2 to 4 seconds away is moderate. Lastly, let's consider the likelihood that if I was hit, I'd be seriously injured or killed. The chart says that if I'm hit by a driver going less than 20 miles or about 32 kilometers an hour, there's about a 20% chance that I would be seriously injured or killed. When I consider that if I use my hearing to cross here, it's highly likely that there's a vehicle coming when it's quiet, and if that happens, it's moderately likely that it's going to hit me, and if that happens, there's a 1 in 5 chance that I'd be seriously injured or killed, that represents a risk that is not acceptable to me, especially given that it's very difficult to know when I'm entering the street. So I would use alternatives, such as getting assistance to approach and cross the street. This analysis applies to this situation only. At other times of the day, the situation could be very different. I might be able to hear the vehicles with much more warning. There might be less traffic, so it would be less likely that I'd be surprised by a vehicle approaching. There may be more pedestrians, and so it would be less likely that drivers would hit me, etc.